Jamie Gunn had took his best mate Marvin Bradshaw's death very badly. He wanted to get it out of his head at every opportunity. He drank heavily and snorted lines of cocaine. His uncle Colin found out and had given him a beating, telling him to stay off the stuff, something other members of his family were not happy about. Colin had even been sent to Coventry for a few weeks. Meanwhile, Jamie continued his mission to get as wasted as he could. Nothing his mother Julie or stepfather Dave Shefford did seemed to have any effect. In July 2004, Michael O'Brien went on trial for Mr. Bradshaw's murder. The Gunn family wondered how Jamie could cope with it all. He couldn't bring himself to go to court and see Mr. O'Brien in the dock. Instead, other relatives would go. Colin especially wanted to stare Mr. O'Brien in the face of the man who had dared to try and kill his nephew. Gary Salmon, the other man police wanted in connection with the murder, was still missing. Colin was happy to hear rumours circulating that he had disposed of not only Gary Salmon, but also James Brody, the young man who had shot Marion Bates and had not been seen since 36 hours after the murder. It all added to his reputation as far as he was concerned. On the 7th of July, tensions began to spill over within the courtroom of Nottingham Crown Court. During a break of proceedings, Colin approached the dock and Mr. O'Brien squared up to him, implying to Mr. Gunn that there was a bullet waiting for him. "Hey Colin, I've got something for you," said Mr. O'Brien as Mr. Gunn walked away from the dock. "Tell that fat Colin I've got something for him, or perhaps that something is coming his way." Mr. Gunn had to be restrained and ushered from the courtroom. He was advised not to return while the case was on. 6 days later, the courtroom again descended into chaos. Mr. O'Brien had been found guilty and was being sentenced to a minimum of 24 years in jail when he launched a tirade of abuse at the family of Marvin Bradshaw. He threw a tumbler of water over them and shouted as he received a 24-year sentence. "Hey you, your son's head looked like a donut. It had a big hole in it with a big red bit in the middle. I'm not bothered, you know. I'm a bad boy. It means nothing to me. I can do this standing on my head. I know where you live as well." Colin Gunn was incensed by the comments. Attempts had been made already to get Mr. O'Brien whilst in prison, but had come to nothing. Police had become aware that the Bestwood cartel had even corrupted prison officers, and they had taken precautions to ensure Mr. O'Brien was safe. Mr. Gunn began thinking about revenge from another angle. He was sure that he could track down Mr. O'Brien's mother, Joan Sterland. He knew that they were in Lincolnshire somewhere because he had traced a phone number for them. Words began to reach Joan's daughter Rosie that the family could be in great danger again as the result of Mr. O'Brien's comments. After several months of quiet, just when they thought they were getting back to normal, the nightmare was back again. On the 13th of July, shortly after her son was jailed for life, Mrs. Sterland rang Rosie and told her that she was really upset with what Michael had said. Crying, she said, "I can't believe he has said that to the family. I want to go and I want to see them and apologise. He should have never have said that to them." "Mum, I really don't think that's a good idea," Rosie told her. "We are all at risk because of what he has said. Just leave it and stay away. Maybe you should ring the police and ask them what sort of risk there is after this." Joan had last contacted Nottinghamshire police on the 19th of April 2004 and spoken to a senior officer. She was keen to know how far the police had got in investigating the shooting at their home in September of 2003. The answer they got was almost nothing. Joan told the officer she had been worried because a few weeks earlier she had spotted one of the Gunn brothers along with another member of the Bestwood cartel in Skegness. Following her son's courtroom outburst, she rang the police the next day and told them she thought the Bestwood cartel might be trying to get to the family after what her son had said. They told her not to worry and they were keeping an eye on things and would let the family know if anything had happened. According to Phil Davis, Nottinghamshire police also held a meeting and decided for the first time that they should inform their counterparts in Lincolnshire that John and Joan Sterling were living in the area. 6 days later, officers who were monitoring the Bestwood cartel became aware that a firearm was being moved into the Boston area of Lincolnshire so that a shooting could be carried out. They sat and they waited, keeping tabs on the movement of Colin Gunn in particular. The Utah team had been busy making huge inroads into Bestwood cartel's drugs operation. Bugs had been placed during the autumn of 2003 and they were now achieving the desired results. The biggest bust took place on the A52 just outside of Nottingham in April of 2005. Darren Kirby, who was one low-level runner for the gang, was on his way back from Liverpool after picking up a huge consignment of drugs when he was pulled over by the police. They claimed that they had a faulty light on his car, but in fact, electronic surveillance had indicated exactly who Mr. Kirby was, what he was carrying, and where he was going well before he had left Liverpool. The faulty light story was concocted to lay a false trail so as not to compromise the other surveillance methods which were being used. When officers asked to search the 31-year-old's van, they found 6 holdalls crammed full of ecstasy, around 600,000 tablets. Tests later revealed the tablets, embossed with the Heineken and PlayStation logos, had a very high active MDMA content, around 70%. They had probably originated in the Netherlands. It was the second largest ecstasy haul by the police in the UK, with an estimated street value of £3 million. Mr. Kirby said he had been just paid £500 for driving and needed the money to pay off his gambling debts. He would receive a 15-year jail term, reduced to 13 on appeal, after admitting his guilt. Before that, in June 2004, police had intercepted a huge shipment of amphetamines and ecstasy near Runcorn, which was on his way back to the Bestwood cartel. The cartel put pressure on one of the couriers involved. Someone must have been talking to the police, they said. The courier wrongly assumed his girlfriend had stitched him up. In fact, the information had come from police surveillance and told the cartel. 2 men wearing boiler suits went to her home in Bestwood, claiming they had a pizza to deliver. She refused to answer the door. 2 days later, the same 2 men in boiler suits strode up to the house and fired a number of shots through the window. The 21-year-old was carrying her 13-month-old baby in her arms when the shots shattered her windows. She was hit by 2 bullets, which narrowly missed her baby, but she lived to tell the tale. Police intelligence indicated that one of the shooters was a 26-year-old junior member of the cartel, who was himself shot for botching up a kidnap job on behalf of the cartel. He allowed the kidnapped victim, who had been abducted because of a £200 debt, to go free, and in retribution, Colin Gunn sent the terrifying John McSally to shoot him for his mistake. Mr. McSally was supposed to kill him, but was only able to wound him in the shoulder. The 26-year-old was charged with the attempted murder of Karina Hancock and 2 counts of possession of a firearm, but the charges were later dropped on advice that there was insufficient evidence against him. On the 11th of June, police busted 41-year-old Andrew Gascoigne and 33-year-old Jason Carroll, 2 of the cartel's foot soldiers. Both had large quantities of drugs in their houses and cars, which were going to be cut up and distributed into smaller deals. They searched Mr. Gascoigne's Range Rover and found nearly a kilo of cocaine, worth £95,700, in the passenger footwell, and a bag of cocaine, worth £19,400 in the glove compartment, as well as sheets of paper with names and phone numbers on them. At Mr. Gascoigne's home, they found £149,000 worth of cocaine in his washing machine, bringing the total of his stash up to £264,200. When the police went to Mr. Carroll's house in Gainsford Crescent, they searched him and found he was carrying a few grams of cocaine and £1,444,000 in cash. He also had some paper with a list of names, phone numbers and an amount of money. Police found £74,100 of cocaine in a cupboard under a sink. There was also £7,260 worth of amphetamines in his freezer, 181 ecstasy tablets worth £905 in a vase, and a coffee tin with some cocaine and some broken ecstasy tablets in it. He had £800 stuffed into a jacket and a wardrobe, electronic scales, and a chemical used to cook the drugs. His total stash of drugs was £83,065. Both men pleaded guilty and were given 10-year sentences in December of 2004. More members of the Bestwood cartel were arrested after a bungled armed raid on the city centre casino on the 11th of November 2004. The gunman, Martin Hogan, was jailed for 12 years and his accomplice, David Martin, got 10 for the hold-up at the Victoria Club in Victoria Street. In passing sentences, Judge Andrew Hamilton referred to the branding of Nottingham as the most dangerous city in England. I visit a number of institutions to talk to students, and one of the first questions they ask is, am I going to be safe in Nottingham? Am I going to be shot in Nottingham? I can assure the public that judges will do everything to ensure that those who commit crime will be given corresponding sentences. Mr. Hogan, 49, formerly of Birchfield Road, Arnold, was found guilty of robbery and possession of an imitation firearm after a trial at Nottingham Crown Court in April 2006. Mr. Martin, who was 27 of Neath Unveil, Sherwood, admitted robbery, possession of an imitation firearm, and a separate offence of an affray. He received an extra 18 months for that offence, to be served after the longer sentence. The robbers had distinguished themselves by committing a catalogue of errors. Mr. Hogan, a convicted thief and burglar, allowed a scarf covering his face to slip during the raid. He pointed the gun at the receptionist before ushering her and other members of staff into a corner of the casino, while Mr. Martin, armed with a claw hammer, emptied out the sports bag. The men tried to make their escape through the fire door, but found it locked. It meant they had to turn back and leave through the main entrance, the court heard. Another member of the gang, Vincent Hawkins, made a poor job of setting light to the getaway vehicle. He burnt himself so severely that he had to call an ambulance and spent 5 days in a hospital's burn unit. Mr. Hawkins, who was 22, received an 18-month prison sentence after admitting to arson. Detectives used mobile phone records to trace all 3 movements. Back in Bestwood, the Gunn family was getting worried about the impact that Michael O'Brien's trial was having on Jamie. He was going on drug-fueled benders on a nightly basis with some members of the cartel, including Michael "Tricky" McNee. Jamie's mum, Julie, tried to keep him in, but he would say that he was nipping out for a bit and then would disappear for days on end. Jamie couldn't get the visions of Marvin dying out of his head. He couldn't even look at pictures of his best friend. Every time a newspaper story ran about Mr. O'Brien's trial, it just brought everything back. Jamie was in self-destruct mode. He didn't care what happened to him. On the 2nd of August 2004, 21-year-old Jamie Gunn was found lying on his bed at his home in Southglade Road. His family couldn't wake him up. His body had given up. The official cause of death was pneumonia, and his 5.5-month-old son Reese would grow up without ever knowing him. The outpouring of grief from the members of the Bestwood cartel was overwhelming. Colin was down near Hampton Lodge near Warwick when David Gunn finally reached him, just after 9:30 AM that day. Colin phoned Jamie's friend Michael "Tricky" McNee immediately. Maybe he knew something. Colin then phoned another of Jamie's friends, John Russell, to tell him about Jamie's death. Tricky McNee hadn't seen Jamie since Sunday. Colin was crying uncontrollably. Jamie was like a son to him. There was also some guilt. Perhaps he shouldn't have given Jamie such a hard time about the drug taking, Colin thought. But no, he wasn't to blame for Jamie's death. It was somebody else, and that somebody else would have to pay. An eye for an eye, 2 must die, 1 for Marv and 1 for Jamie. The day after Jamie's body was found, Tricky McNee told his brother John what had happened. John McNee was locked up at Ranby Prison near Retford, and phone calls were being routinely bugged. Tricky revealed to his older brother that he had been drowning his sorrows with senior members of the Bestwood cartel in the Royal Hunt pub. "I can't believe it's happened," he said. "I only saw Jamie on Sunday. I had the big man, Colin Gunn, with me, and he was in tears. I've had Baz on the phone as well. He was in tears. It's hit Colin and Baz, Dave Barrett, really badly. I'm fucking off to Scotland for a week. It's gonna take 2 weeks for anything to happen anyway." Colin had already made it clear that there would be revenge after holding an army council style summit at the pub the day after Jamie's death. No point of going for Michael O'Brien. This was personal now, and his cold heart was dreaming up the cruelest revenge he could think of. Something that would leave Mr. O'Brien and his sisters, Rosie and Tanette, in more pain than it could be achieved of taking his own life away. Colin didn't need lines of cocaine to make him feel confident. He already felt supreme already. He had been implicated in no less than 4 murders and more than 50 shootings, and he hadn't been charged with a single crime since 1998. He was, as he thought, invincible. Nevertheless, precautions would need to be taken, including buying some new pay-as-you-go phones for the job. They already had access to a couple of clean guns. Beretta 9000, a gangster's best friend, reliable and deadly. Tricky would not be going to Scotland after all. A flurry of phone calls were already being made to try and trace Mr. Gunn's targets, and the contacts the gang had in British Telecom were working their magic. Joan and John Sterland were effectively walking dead. Just a few days after Jamie's death, Joan received a phone call from Nottinghamshire police. "Emotions are running high, Joan," the officer said. "Just watch your back." Joan phoned her daughter Rosie late that night. "Rosie, I'm really scared. I think the Gunns are going to go all out and try and get to us, you and Tanette. I want you to get out of the house now." "Mum, I'm not getting the kids up. It's past midnight. Ring the police and ask them what you should do." A few minutes later, an officer from Nottinghamshire police rang through to Rosie. "Your mum has asked me to call you because she's upset," he said. She's heard some more stuff about people from Bestwood. Rosie was angry. Well, I'm not being funny, but you're the police officer. We've been hearing we are in danger for months now, but you would have moved us if we were. You're the ones who know what's going on. So what do you think? Wow, Rosie, I think your mum is overreacting, the officer told her, according to Rosie's account. To be honest, I think it's all just a load of pie in the sky. The day after Jamie Gunn's death, Colin Gunn began planning the most audacious and brutal crime of his career. He would use weapons smuggled into the country from Latvia by a Polish lorry driver. They were clean Beretta 9000S pistols. No history, no comeback. Colin contacted a man from the Carlton area of Nottingham called Kevin Holm, whose father Raymond was best friends with John Sterling and had visited the couple in April that year. Colin knew this because Kevin Holm's sister, Holly, lived with 38-year-old Shane Bird, a long-time associate of the Gunns. Mr. Bird had served a jail term for his involvement in large-scale cigarette smuggling with Robert Briggs Price. On the 3rd of August, there was frantic activity on Colin Gunn's phone. He was calling Mr. Holm and Mr. Bird, trying to get information about where John and Joan Sterling lived. By that afternoon, he had their phone number and postcode, but no full address. He asked Mr. Bird to find out through his contacts. One of them was a former British Telecom worker called Stephen Poundle. Mr. Bird told Mr. Poundle he needed to know the address of J. Sterling in Lincolnshire. Mr. Poundle phoned his mate Anthony Kelly, who worked for British Telecom in Nottingham. Mr. Kelly couldn't access records for Lincolnshire, so he phoned another friend, Andrew Pickering. By 8 AM on the 5th of August, after extensive checks carried out by his former work colleagues, Mr. Poundle had the address of John and Joan Sterling, and by 8:43 AM that day, he had phoned Mr. Bird to let him know. Mr. Bird spent the next hour trying to get through to Colin Gunn, until Mr. Gunn eventually answered his phone at 9:47 AM. It's not Sutton-on-Sea, it's Trustford. The call lasted just a few seconds, but it's all he needed. Mr. Gunn phoned Michael Tricky McNee at 10:14 AM. Tricky? Put Scotland on the back burner. The job is on, so get yourself sorted. Mr. McNee had been chosen as one of the shooters. He was itching to extract revenge for Jamie's death. The identity of the other shooter had not been decided. It might be John Russell, who Colin phoned a few minutes earlier after speaking to Mr. McNee, but Colin was also pumping himself up to do it. Such was his guilt and rage over Jamie's death. At 10:37 AM, after speaking to Mr. Gunn, Mr. Bird rang Stephen Poundle. "Thanks for all your help, mate," said Mr. Bird. "There will be a drink in it for you, so don't worry." Mr. Poundle, Mr. Pickering and Mr. Kelly had all unwittingly been used in a grand conspiracy. As with many others, they will have to live with their actions for the rest of their life. Mr. Bird from Carlton Hill, Nottingham, would later claim in court that the phone calls between him and Mr. Poundle were in order to do a favour for another man who had asked him for a phone number of his aunt, Joan Sterling. The day that the gang got confirmation of Joan and John Sterling's address, they began to work out the logistics of the operation and travelled to Lincolnshire to case out the house at Radio St. Peter's. Colin Gunn drove with the 19-year-old Tricky McNee in the car. The classified section of the Nottinghamshire Evening Post would be filled with obituaries for Jamie Gunn for the next 2 weeks, in an unprecedented outpouring of grief for the 19-year-old. Nevertheless, there were many people who had dealings with the Gunn brothers, who knew it was in their own interest to show some respect. There was even a notice from Godfrey Hibbert, who had looked after drugs for the cartel to his own cost. The funeral was set for Friday the 13th of August at St. Mary's Church near Bulwell Town Centre. Notice went out to the people of Bestwood and Bulwell that they would be expected to show their respects by attending. Jamie would be buried near his best friend Marvin Bradshaw at Wilford Cemetery. John Russell and Tricky McNee sent their own death notice to Nottingham Evening Post. It read, "Jamie Gunn, bro, we still don't believe it. You are still with us. If not by our side, then in our hearts and our souls. Don't for 1 minute think we will ever forget you. You are in our thoughts every day, every minute. Just can't believe you're gone, bro. Love you to bits always. Deepest sympathy to Julie, Chef and the family. From Tricky and John." On the 4th of August, Colin and David Gunn, Michael McNee, John Russell and others who have never been identified met at the Kingfisher caravan site where David had a caravan. David stayed there for a few days while Colin drove back and forth to Nottingham. David was back in Nottingham by the 8th of August, while Mr. McNee and Mr. Russell took his place at the Caravan. On 6:45 PM that day, Colin went to the Walsworth store in Skegness and bought a T-Mobile Sagan pay-as-you-go phone to contact other members of the gang. All the gang would need to be using pay-as-you-go phones with no history. For years, the cartel had used this method of communication, often buying their phones from a shop called Dr. & Lock in Bulwell. Clean mobile was an absolute necessity in their line of business. David Gunn texted his brother, "What time are you here, Fats? The bits are ready. 3 of them. I've got them built and sorted out some menthol." David knew about firearms, how to acquire them and put them together. His police record said as much. The Italian-made 9mm 9000S came with 3 parts, and menthol was often used to clean the semi-automatic handguns so that they had smooth action. However, David would later give an entirely different explanation for his text message to Colin. "I'm texting him to tell him to get some spliffs rolled," he claimed. Colin couldn't roll a spliff to save his life, so I would do it for him. The menthol referred to the menthol flavoured cigarettes that I put in the joints, giving them a minty cool flavour that he liked. At the end of it, apart from you putting me in a few places using my phone, you haven't really got me doing anything. I'm shocked you've even got me here. John Russell was busy smoking himself stupid while Tricky McNee drank and fidgeted. A takeaway meal had been delivered to the Caravan. It was the 7th of August. Colin, John and Tricky had been reconnoitering at Radio St. Peter's, and Colin had driven over to Trustfoot 3 times that day. It was obsessive last-minute planning to make sure that nothing could go wrong. A black Volkswagen Passat, stolen a few weeks earlier from a house in Nottingham, would be used to drive the 2 gunmen to and from the target house. Then afterwards it would be ditched and burned. They had already found an isolated spot around 2 miles away in Crawcroft Lane to dispose of the car. It was perfect, no houses nearby. The shooters would then be transported by another car back to the Caravan at Ingold Mells or Nottingham if necessary. Mr. Russell and Mr. McNee made another trip to the Sterling's house late on Saturday evening to satisfy themselves about the layout of the property and to ease any niggling last-minute doubts, though Mr. Russell was nearly caught when one of the neighbours spotted him leaping over the Sterling's garden fence. When the morning of the 8th of August broke, it held all promise of optimism that the sunny mornings have, and so it was for Joan and John Sterling when they woke to the sun steaming their chalet. They had barely had breakfast when their neighbour called round. "I just thought you ought to know that I saw a prowler jump over your fence last night," she told Joan. "We think they might have disturbed them because they just ran off." The sunshine went from Joan Sterling's face. She didn't hide her worries well. "Oh right, I'd better tell John about it." Joan went back inside to phone Nottinghamshire police. She felt apprehensive. 5 miles away at a caravan park, Russell and McNee were waiting for their orders from Colin Gunn. They wouldn't have to wait long. By 1 PM, they were acting the fools on the promenade of Trustfoot. Colin had told them to blend in like holidaymakers, so Mr. Russell brought a kite which they attempted to fly. They chatted to a couple of girls on the promenade, telling the young women with stories about Nottingham and how they should meet up later for a drink. Then at about 2 PM, Colin rang and gave the order to strike. Perhaps he was close to Radio St. Peter's. If he was, then he would have seen the Sterling's neighbour leave the house with relatives to go for a walk. She would not be returning until 4 PM. It was a good time to commit a murder, with a few witnesses in the vicinity to hear the gunshots. The VW Passat drove up the curb next to the chalet and the hazard lights came on. 2 gunmen swiftly jumped out of the car, carrying a holdall which hid the Berettas. The blue overalls and caps and silver gloves that they wore gave Joan and John Sterling the impression that they were on official business. Perhaps it was something to do with the call they had made to the police. Either way, the assassins walked straight into the house and carried out their deed with swift precision. Bullet casings lay strewn across the floor. Joan and John Sterling had just been murdered in cold blood by 2:20 PM. As the assassins left the house, a taxi driver spotted them getting into a car. They screeched off towards Crawcroft Lane, tailgating a car as they tried to overtake in narrow lanes. Whoever was at the wheel of the Volkswagen Passat drove like a madman, and the 2 gunmen were seen arguing as their car sped down the road. Before setting the vehicle alight, Tricky McNee dumped a load of bullet casings into the car. It would all help burn the car to a cinder and destroy any forensic evidence. By 3 PM, the 2 assassins were back at the Kingfisher's Caravan Park in Ingold Mells. By the evening, they would be laughing, having a few points, and even texting the girls they had met at the promenade earlier. Colin Gunn had planned the assassination meticulously. Within 24 hours of the murders, journalists had made the link between Mr. and Mrs. Sterling's brutal slaying and the jailing of her son Michael O'Brien at Nottingham Crown Court a few weeks earlier. The story story was all over the national papers by Tuesday morning. Worst seaside couple shot in revenge, said the Daily Mail. Couple shot dead in gang revenge at the seaside. Middle-aged victims linked to pub killer, by the Daily Telegraph. Mystery killers gunned down two perfect grandparents in their seaside home. Revenge of the hitmen, by the Express. Couple's new life ends in murder. Police find bodies after tip-off, by the Guardian. Execution, gangland murder of the sneering killer's family, by the Mirror. And two executed in a murder feud, by the Sun. Couple's murder is linked to pub shooting case, by the Times. All focus shifted toward Jamie Gunn's funeral, which was being held the following Friday. Jamie's mother, Julie, gave tearful interview to the newspapers, but journalists who tried to speak to other members of the family, such as Colin Gunn, were chased down the road with baseball bats. Julie described how Jamie had lost the will to live after seeing his best mate murdered. She said she had heard rumours about the Sterlings, but it was naught to do with us. Jamie couldn't look at a picture of Marvin for ages. He just used to break down, said Julie. It took 9 months for him to say Marvin's name again. No adult should have to see what he has seen. The estate is eerie at the moment. It's in shock. The support we have had has been amazing. Some people have had to deal with it in their own way, but we have had an army. But the army was crumbling. Everybody knew Colin Gunn was behind the Sterling's murder, and Jamie's funeral would be the last show of any significant support for the Bestwood cartel. One former member said, "Yeah, there were attacks on this person or that, but most of that was business, keeping people in line and off their patch. When the Sterlings got done, that was it. People started seeing what was happening. Colin was out of control. You can't go off shooting someone's grandmother just to get at someone else." That was Colin's downfall. There will still be people who will try and say he's good and he got stitched up by the cops, but he did a truly evil thing that day, and people started seeing him in a different light. That was the day he lost the support of the estate. More than 1,000 people turned out for Jamie's funeral. A black horse-drawn carriage took the coffin through the streets of Bulwell and up to Wilford Hill Crematorium after the service. The streets were not only lined with hundreds of locals, but with also Mercedes and BMWs. It was a depressing day, full of menacing darkness and teeming rain, and with men in black suits, wearing dark shades, as if they had just walked on the set of Reservoir Dogs. Only this was for real. It was a gangster's funeral, and Jamie Gunn was buried in a brand new Lacoste tracksuit, which was specially brought by the family. After the service, the local vicar, Reverend Christopher Gale, said, "I did think about calling for there to be no revenge, but it's a difficult time, and you have to be sensitive. You have to remember that people are grieving at the loss of their 19-year-old son." A few weeks later, the family of Joan Sterland attended her funeral at Wilford Crematorium. It was a much quieter affair. The imprisoned Michael O'Brien did not attend his mother's funeral either, or John Sterland's the previous week. The family could not even bury their dead in peace. Helicopters swarmed overhead, and men in dark uniforms patrolled the perimeter of the graveyard with semi-automatic handguns. It took the police more than 24 hours to go and see Joan's daughter Rosie to inform her of her mother and stepfather's murder. They didn't even realise she was at risk. A dedicated witness protection team didn't even exist until 2005 in Nottinghamshire, and several officers who worked witness protection had breakdowns. They had never been properly trained for the task. Rosie Sterling was scathing about the way the matter was handled. "They turned up at 4:30 in the morning. 2 police officers," she said. "They said, 'We've got some news for you. You might want to sit down. There's been an accident in Lincolnshire. 2 people are deceased.' I said, 'Who?' They said, 'We believe it's John and Joan Sterland, and they have been shot and they are dead, basically.' I said, 'You know who's done it. You better go and arrest the gunnies, hadn't you?' They said, 'Wow, can you notify the rest of the family and then we'll leave it to you?' And they walked out. They weren't even here for 5 minutes. I didn't know what to do next. I said to my partner, 'I can't believe they've just left us.' Lincolnshire police rang me the next afternoon and asked if Notts police had been in to see me yet. They said, 'We've got your sister to Nair, but who's looking after you?' They said I should complain about Nottingham police. They sent someone down from Lincolnshire police who spoke to me and then asked me if I would identify my mum. From that minute, we were put into a hotel with my sister and our mobile phones taken off us, and we were told we couldn't go back to Nottingham. We were kept under armed guard, and I couldn't even be allowed out of the hotel room, and if anyone saw us, we had to be moved. I spoke to Lincolnshire police and said, 'You knew she was in danger, so why didn't you go straight round to my mum's house?' They said, 'Oh, she didn't want flashing light.' I said, 'She meant she didn't want people drawing attention to her, not that she didn't want them to hurry up. She didn't want panda cars. She didn't want Not that she didn't want them to come round, she was frightened to death. For my mum's funeral, we couldn't even grieve properly. I gave instructions for her to be buried in her own clothes. I found out afterwards from the funeral parlour that she was buried in a hospital gown. The funeral itself was appalling. I had to sign a document that if I went to it, it could result in my injury or death. I went, obviously. The whole road was closed off specifically for it. I sat and told the officer in charge we wanted a horse and carriage, and he said we would have accommodated that. We told Lynx we would do whatever you wanted. I'm not very happy about that. It really upset us at the time. I don't understand what's going on with these two forces. To be honest, I've not been back to the cemetery since that day. I've asked them if they could arrange it, and they said no. It's like they've got rid of us now. After everything that's happened with my mum, we've now been told that we don't fall under the criteria for witness protection because we weren't actually the witnesses. I said, well, what do we fall under? And they said, we don't know. I changed my surname and I did that myself. They wouldn't do it for me. The police kept us in Lincolnshire for at least 2 weeks. We were in a hotel overlooking a lake for the first 4 days, and then we were moved to a disused agricultural college in Lincolnshire. It was a right state. All the firearms police were downstairs and we were upstairs. Me and my partner and the kids, my sister, her partner and her kids. We had a room each. It was appalling. There were no carpets on the floor, the kitchenette was dirty, and if we want any shopping, they had to bring it to us. The kids weren't allowed to play in the field at the back. The firearm guys didn't want to sit outside with them. My partner at the time needed to go home to sort a few things out. They said they would take him to his home and bring him back the same day. I got a phone call at night time saying he doesn't want to be part of this. He wants to finish with you and he isn't coming back. I was like, what? I had my mobile phone. I hadn't given it to the police, and I spoke to my partner and he said, are you alright? What's going on? They said they would come back and get me tomorrow, but they've rung me up and said, you don't want me to come back. I said, no, they just told me that you don't want to come back. He said, no, and he was going mad. I went mental and walked out. I told them they were just trying to save money, the way I saw it. I walked 6 miles to the nearest village, being followed by them. I phoned my partner and asked him to come and pick me up. The witness protection people said they would drive me and my partner and come and collect us in a few days. I just want a normal life now. Everything was cleared out of our homes and put into storage. We were in a privately rented house for 18 months and that was being furnished. When I actually got my own home, they said they would bring the stuff down, but everything was just green with mold all over it. The clothes had even been chewed by mice. Half of it was even destroyed. They didn't even empty the fridge. There was food in there that had been in there for 18 months. Even my cooker had oil in the tray. My mum's things were delivered to me that had just been thrown into boxes. All the stuff was just chewed by mice. The only time I'd been to the house in Trustford was in February 2004, before my mum died, and this shows you how frightened she was. She met me at the station and we got off the train. We went to the station for 30 minutes, waiting to see if we knew anyone who got off the train and see if we'd been followed. She wouldn't leave, her and John. That's how scared she was. So for them to say she didn't want the police to come round is bullshit. My mum was terrified. She was frightened for her life. And for them to make out that she was blasé about it, but she was not at all. If she was, she would have gone back to Nottingham. In the days that followed, there were a lot of drawn out faces at Nottinghamshire Police headquarters. The murders had not only shaken the most hardened of officers, but they now realised that they were in the middle of a huge mess. Senior officers wondered why nothing had been picked up on the books. The National Crime Squad officers carrying out surveillance had not alerted them to any specific information that indicated a double slaying was about to take place, and all main members of the cartel were being watched and listened to around the clock. But the clues were already there, particularly after Michael O'Brien's trial and the death of Jamie Gunn. It seems incredible that no one realised the extreme danger that the couple were in. For their part, Lincolnshire police were very angry. They soon discovered that they had not been fully briefed on the threats towards the Sterlings, and if they had been given a comprehensive history about the couple, as Nottinghamshire claimed, they had no evidence to show for it. No love was lost between the two forces. An employment tribunal back in 1996, in which a young female detective from Lincolnshire sued her force for sex discrimination, had soured relations with Nottinghamshire for years. Initial inquiries into the matter, which led the detective, Sadina Fleming, receiving a substantial payout after suffering a vendetta at the hands of senior male colleagues, were conducted by Nottinghamshire officers, and this led to a bad blood with some of their Lincolnshire counterparts. Nevertheless, Detective Superintendent Graham White, who headed the Lincolnshire police investigation into the Sterling's murder, was determined to bring the culprits to justice. Everybody knew who had carried out the killings. It was plain as day. Evidence would be needed, however, and that evidence was in the technology which had given birth to the mobile phone. Analysis began on the mobile phone numbers used that day of the murder in the Trusthorpe area. Computer programs analysed and matched those numbers with any known to be used by the members of the Bestwood cartel, or which had been later used in Nottingham. Gradually, the numbers were whittled down. The use of pay-as-you-go phones made the checking more protracted, but eventually, officers isolated numbers which they could carry out some meaningful checks on. One was a phone which had been brought in a Woolworth store in Skegness at 6:30 PM on the 4th of August. It was a T-Mobile Saga. When officers scanned CCTV footage of the high street from around that time, they saw the unmistakably burly, shaven head figure of Colin Gunn walking near the traffic lights. From that phone, they derived other numbers that had been called. Most had gone dead on the day of the murders, but a few were still active. By early September, police began to reel in the members of the gang. As if the murders of Marion Bates and the Sterlings were not enough, the tragic killing of a 14-year-old girl was to bring the violence of the city's gang into an even starker relief. Danielle Beacon was gunned down whilst walking home from the annual Goose Fair, held every October in the Forest Fields. It had become an event often used by rival gangs from the NG Triangle to settle long-standing disputes. Police were often tipped off about impending trouble, but in October 2004, there were no such warnings. In the early hours of the 9th of October, Danielle was with a large group of friends as they entered the Chase area of St Anne's. Danielle was no angel. She had probably smoked cannabis that night, according to what was later found in her bloodstream, and had a lot more money in her pocket than her mum could account for. She mixed with many families who were dealing drugs on the estate, but was about as innocent as she could be, given that St Anne's life was running through her veins. She had grown up with crime all around her and had recently been living with her father Dale in Derby, who was now holding large amounts of cannabis at the time. Just 5 days before Danielle's death, Dale, who had moved away from St Anne's in 1995, was at Derby Crown Court pleading guilty to possession and growing highly potent skunk cannabis. In a subsequent court case less than a year later, he was convicted of possessing skunk and was again given a rehabilitation order. Danielle, or Baby D as she was known on the street, had decided to move back to Nottingham where her mum Paula and many of her friends had grown up and lived. It was a decision with fatal consequences. At around 12:30 AM, as the youngsters walked from Valley Road, a gold Citroen Zara saloon appeared and drove towards them. The car appeared to stall, then the engine revved and one of the tinted windows on the passenger side opened. 3 shots were fired, popping like firecrackers. The youngsters scattered screaming, all except Danielle, who fell to the ground. The others saw a gloved hand come out the window of the car, making a sign of a W, signifying the Waterfront gang, as the car drove off. Danielle was just yards from the safety of her home, and her mother rushed out to tend to her, but it was too late. Danielle's last words to her mother were, "I'm not going to make it, I'm dying." She lost consciousness, and despite attempts at the Queen's Medical Centre to save her, died soon after she arrived at casualty. Meadows gang members Junior Prentice Andrews and Mark Yardy Kelly were arrested among 20 others during Operation Holly after Mr. Kelly's car was traced down following the shooting. Mr. Andrews had come out of prison just a few months earlier after being sentenced to 4 years for a brutal robbery. He was a small-time heroin dealer on the Meadows estate, but was heavily into gang culture and rap music. Sometimes, he carried a small handgun in a Prada bag around his neck. Mr. Andrews had a number of tattoos on his body suggesting gang membership, including an NG2 signifying the Meadows estate, a smoking gun with the initials WFG signifying the Waterfront gang, and TRU meaning the real untouchables. Crucially, police seized a mobile phone belonging to him that contained a long rap message. It was footage of him walking through the St Anne's estate in the early hours of the morning by himself. On the footage, recorded just a few days before Danielle's murder, Mr. Andrews was heard talking into the phone as he recorded road signs in St Anne's. He rapped into the phone with a little patois. "I'm here, Prentice, on my own like a real G. Waterfront's most wanted. I'm on the creep. I haven't even got no gun. I go anywhere on my own. I'm a real killer. You can't see any Waterfront man come this way. I rob enough man down there. Which waterfront man could say they've been down here at 2 o'clock in the morning? Look, I'm here on my own. Now you get me. Look at that prentice on his own, rolling around the Ville, St. Anne's, like it's Meadows. I don't really know anybody like me who's a real killer. I come up here and I haven't even got my bulletproof vest. I've got one at home. Prentice walking about St. Anne's Ville this time of year with no gun, no vest. All I've got is one broomstick. Waterfront. I've been, I've sworn, and I've conquered. On another recording, Mr. Andrews is heard rapping, "When we shoot to kill, we shoot the Ville, St. Anne's for real." How many people are gonna get popped before you realise it's ride or die? And that means I'm ride and you're gonna die. Mr. Andrews and Mr. Kelly were convicted and sentenced to life with a minimum tariff of 32 years each in prison. Mr. Kelly's tariff was reduced to 29 on appeal. He had been born in Jamaica, hence his Yardie Mark nickname, but had strong gang connections to Birmingham and eventually became a member of the Raiders gang from Smethwick. This gang had strong links with the infamous Johnson crew, whose war with the Burger Bar crew in Birmingham culminated in the 2001 New Year's Day murders of Letitia Shakespeare and Charlene Ellis outside a hair salon. The Raiders helped supply the drugs to the Meadows gang. For all bravado that he showed, Mr. Andrews had not killed before, and it was highly unlikely that he intended to shoot Danielle Beacon that night. The bullet that killed her had almost certainly ricocheted off either the pavement or the building before hitting Danielle in the abdomen. Mr. Kelly and Mr. Andrews had gone to Clifton that night after drinking with a group of young men in the Toll Bridge. They had even got into a chat with a professional footballer who was in the pub, bolstered by some cocaine that they had snorted in the toilets of the Toll Bridge. Mr. Andrews and Mr. Kelly then went on to burgle a property in Clifton. They had been looking for someone who owed them money, and their mission then took them to St. Anne's, but they were unable to locate the person they were after. When they saw the crowd walking through St. Anne's, somebody in the car decided to let off a few rounds to tell them that Meadows had been there. There were at least 2, probably 3 others in the car when Danielle was shot dead, and fingerprints taken from the murder car were matched to 3 individuals known to the police. All were young men who had links to the killer and the Meadows, but they all had alibis for the time of the murder. Of course, they could have innocently been in the car on a previous occasion, but it helped not one bit in terms of closure of the case for Danielle Beacon's family, who were left with the feeling that not all those responsible had been caught for the murder.